may have heard that Keith Jackson died over the weekend. Keith Jackson, the legendary college football voice on ABC Sports. I would say it's about 15 years ago I got a chance to be at a banquet where I was at the same table with Keith Jackson. He was getting a real big award and I was getting a lesser one. And it was interesting for me to kind of listen to him, and a few of us got a chance to talk to him about different things. And for a while I worked in Savannah, Georgia. And I also worked in Greensboro, North Carolina. I spent about 3 years of my life living in the South early in my career. Jackson's from Carrollton, Georgia, which is about 50 miles from Atlanta, not too far from the Alabama border. And there was part of him that always go back to those Georgia rural roots. And I remember, for example, by the way, he hated people going, "Whoa, Nelly," which was kind of his catchphrase. He said he only did it a couple times. It seemed to catch on. In fact, you learn, by the way, that was one of the things, if you don't really want to have a long conversation with him, bring that up, because it was going to stop right there. But if you get to talking to Keith Jackson a little bit about kind of how he came into the early days of television, wherever it became fascinating. So he grew up on a farm, rural Georgia. His father went to prison early, didn't know him very well. His mom was a nurse, worked his way through. When he was 17 years old, basically his kind of work on the farm or get out, he went and joined the Marine Corps. This is right after World War II. Spent 4 years in the Marines and then came out and thought, okay, I got the GI Bill, I could do something. And he went to Washington State. And from there, actually, for a while, he was studying criminology, maybe going into law enforcement. But at that time, now this is the 50s, they had a broadcasting department, and he got kind of interested in maybe doing it. Because he said as a kid, growing up on that farm, you know, the radio was it. Remember, no TV or anything like that. In fact, I think he didn't see TV until he was in the Marine Corps. So he's there, and he kind of went to work at some small stations. I think Moscow, Idaho was his first stop, and then later he was in Seattle on TV. And in 1865, I mean, 1865 feels like that sometimes, it was 1965. It's kind of a joke that Keith would do, 1865, 1965, because remember one point he goes, you know, I called games where they played two-way football. I remember him telling me that. It's a two-way. He said, same guys played offense and defense. And he said, some ways I think it's a lot better. In fact, this is, again, this is like around 2002, somewhere in there. And he was, like a lot of us get old thinking the old days were better, but he was talking about how back then, you know, college football was a big deal, but it wasn't the industrial complex you see now. And coaches made a lot of money, but they weren't making $7 million or whatever. They were making, you know, nice salaries, $50,000 or maybe $100,000. And he also said, too, that he felt that TV and all that was getting too much showbiz going on. You know, he was a guy that felt you set up the game. He had these colorful phrases. I remember the offensive linemen were the big uglies, the big uglies. And then, you know, there wasn't just a fumble, it was a fumble. And a couple other things there, you know, maybe a little back running right. It was a little itty bitty thing. You know, it was just, again, the Southern vernacular that he grew up with. It was so natural. And, of course, a lot of the games were played in the South. It just sort of fit together. And back when Keith Jackson was around, it was as I would say, a three-channel world, ABC, NBC, and CBS, the three worlds. So when Keith Jackson went to do a college game, it was the big game. It wasn't like now on any weekend. There's 50 games, there's 100 games on, depending upon how many TV sets and how many stations and how many everything you want to watch. You watch some online, stream it. But back then it was, you know, and he would talk about the Rose Bowl being the granddaddy of them all and that, you know. So again, I'm just kind of thinking about this, but one other thing struck me, and this came from a column in the Kansas City Star by Vay Gregorian. And Gregorian actually for a while was working with Keith Jackson on a book, and he had taped like 20 hours of interviews, and then Jackson decided not to do it. But here's what the things that Jackson, he said, well, how would you sum up being a broadcaster? And this is what Jackson told Gregorian. He said, there are times I turn on athletic context, and I'm quite sure my profession has died. If he wants to go into show business, he should go back to vaudeville and get his own stage. I'm here to amplify, clarify, punctuate. Don't intrude. I live by that. I do not, in any sense, at any time, try to intrude in what's happening in the game. I'm here merely to define it. And I'll tell you, those are great words even now. My favorite broadcasters, whether you're talking Tom Hamilton on the radio. And by the way, I think John Michael doing the Cavs or Jimmy Donovan are pretty good. The old radio guys tend to do this. They pretty much stick to the game. They make it colorful like Jackson did, but it's the game. Or Joe Tate, my close friend, they all did that. And of course, Keith was one of the pioneers. Rest in peace, Keith Jackson.